The International Criminal Court has just issued an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, and the whole world is talking about it. This is an incredibly important development in Israel's ongoing war with Iran. And I call it a war with Iran because that's really what it is. Yes, they are dealing with Hamas in Gaza. Yes, they're dealing with Hezbollah in Lebanon and even the Houthis coming out of Yemen. But each of those three groups is backed by Iran militarily, financially, etc. So really, Israel's war is with Iran. Now, this development by the ICC to issue arrest warrants not only for Netanyahu, but also for Gallant means that the ICC is recognizing that the accusations that have been brought forth by the members of the ICC against Israel's leadership have grounds for justification. The accusations facing Netanyahu and Gallant are nothing short of what you and I have been watching for the last year. We have seen the systematic targeting of civilians through the use of both military equipment and non-military means, such as starvation, the systematic removal of water and medicine and fuel sources, which are required for civilian populations to maintain some semblance of life. These are not military targets that are being neutralized in order to prevent an enemy from being able to carry out attacks. These are attacks against civilians directly and indirectly, and that is the claim of the ICC. Now, it's important to understand that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is not the highest recognized court in the United Nations. In fact, the ICC is separate from the UN altogether. The highest court recognized by the UN is called the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ. Now, this is a little bit bureaucratic and complicated, but I'll try to simplify it. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, is recognized by the UN so that countries can have legal disputes against each other, but they cannot have criminal disputes or criminal accusations between each other. For that reason, in 1998, a new statute was developed that would lead to the opening of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. Now, as that statute grew from 1998 to 2002, multiple members of the UN chose not to sign on to be part of the International Criminal Court. Included in that group are the United States, Russia, Israel, India, and many, many others. So while the ICC is recognized by more than 120 countries within the UN itself is more than 160 countries strong. So there's a delta there, a difference of about 40 countries. The difference between UN and ICC participation is interesting enough. Why members would be part of the UN but not part of the ICC. But even more interesting are the specific countries that have chosen not to ratify the statute that led to the ICC. The United States, Russia, and China being the most important three of the group, because the United Nations Permanent Security Council includes the United States, Russia, and China. Now, the UN Permanent Security Council's tasked with maintaining peace and removing threats that face the United Nations worldwide. That is their calling. They are there specifically to make sure that there is peace and a lack of conflict, especially unjust conflict, among participating members in the UN. And yet, for some reason, each of these three countries chose not to ratify the Rome Statute that led to the International Criminal Court. Now, each of those three countries have their own reasons for why they wouldn't participate, but let me tell you what happened specifically in the case of the United States, because this is really interesting. In 1998, the United Nations moved to create the ICC. At the time, President Bill Clinton was in favor of the ICC and started drafting the United States' participation in that treaty. However, it took 4 years and a change in presidency to George Bush Jr. before the actual Rome Statute was completed. And by the time George Bush was actually brought to the table to sign the treaty in 2002, the United States was already engaged in active wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, Bush was concerned that if the United States signed on to be part of the ICC, that would open American military soldiers to prosecution by non-American juries and non-American courts. Because the ICC sticks to a standard of justice and due process that is separate from each of the member countries within the ICC. So George Bush Jr. did not want to see the situation where an American soldier might be tried as a war criminal by the ICC, even though that person was free of prosecution within the United States. So that's why the United States did not ratify the statute in 2002. Now, Russia and China, India, Israel, they all followed suit in a similar fashion with a similar justification to protect their own people. But what that led to is the confusion that we see now, where there's a United Nations that supports an international criminal court, even though not all members in the United Nations recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So what does that mean for Netanyahu and Gallant? Based on their history of travel, it means that their travel will be greatly restricted because many of the countries that Netanyahu specifically travels to outside of Israel are countries that recognize the ICC and adhere to the jurisdiction of the ICC. Some of those countries include Germany, the United Kingdom, and of course Jordan. These are countries that Netanyahu travels to. However, many of the countries that also recognize the ICC have already voiced their willingness to let Netanyahu visit, one of those countries being, of course, Hungary. Now, Hungary is a very interesting example because Hungary is one of the countries that actually supports Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. And of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin also is one of the individuals that has an open arrest warrant by the ICC that has not been prosecuted yet. If we use Putin as a test case for what we can expect to see from Netanyahu, we have seen Putin travel to China. We have seen Putin travel to Mongolia. We have seen Putin travel abroad without threat or concern to the ICC arrest warrant. That said, we have not really seen him travel into many countries that recognize ICC jurisdiction. The same is true for Netanyahu. We are likely to see Netanyahu continue to travel. We are also likely to see several countries that do recognize the ICC still allow Netanyahu to travel into those countries. This is going to create a very interesting divide in Israel and its Western allies, because many of Israel's closest allies actually also closely support the International Criminal Court. The United Kingdom, France, Germany. In fact, the UK and France are actually two of the members that sit on the UN's Permanent Security Council. So while China, Russia, and the United States do not participate in the ICC and are part of the UN Security Council, the UK and France are members that recognize the ICC and are also members of the UN Permanent Security Council. So if Netanyahu and Gallant try to travel into any country in Europe, they can expect that that country will enforce the ICC jurisdiction and possibly even arrest these two men as soon as they get off the plane in the airport, while the United States, Russia, and China are likely to let Netanyahu visit with no issues at all. The last point I want to make here is possibly the most important. Now remember that Netanyahu is a democratically elected leader in Israel. That said, he is not a popular leader in Israel. His support and popularity has actually waxed and waned multiple times, not just in the last year, but in the preceding years before that. He has been known to be hawkish. He is known to be over-aggressive. He is known to be very, very conservative in not only his policies, but the actions that he takes. And that's exactly what we've seen with his ground assaults into Gaza and his ground assaults into Lebanon. Even Netanyahu's war cabinet has not been unanimously supportive of his efforts in Gaza. Keep in mind that Benny Gantz was a member of the war cabinet that actually resigned less than a year ago. So while Netanyahu has been prosecuting conflict on all sides, north, south, east, and west of Israel, you have not seen strong support for Netanyahu and his policies for those conflicts from the Israeli people. Now that the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for Netanyahu with stated war crimes against the Palestinian people, the people of Israel are truly split. There are initial signs of early support for Netanyahu, but international analysts agree that in the long term, Netanyahu's reputation will continue to decline. Simply put, it doesn't look good for a democratic prime minister to be accused of war crimes by an international body of more than 120 individual countries. With a new president-elect in the United States, escalating conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and of course the most recent issuing of an arrest warrant for leadership in Israel in their war against Iran, the world is nothing short of interesting and dynamic. I'm going to keep following these developments and sharing my insights and knowledge as a trained CIA officer with you. If you want to learn how to see the world through the eyes of a spy, click on the link in the description below. I'll see you on the other side.